This is the new iPhone 14 Pro. It could be the most different iPhone in the last 5 years. The 12 megapixel sensors used since 2015 are now replaced with a 48 megapixel one. The notch is now gone and the always-on display is finally here too. On the outside, it may seem like a perfect phone, and while there's lots of great things about it, there were also quite a few hidden letdowns for me. The 14 Pro is certainly very well built, just like the 13 Pro, with a stainless steel frame and a matte glass back. The design didn't really change much from last gen. The stainless steel frame is more durable than aluminum, but it's also a major contributing factor to this phone being pretty heavy for its size. At 6.1 inches, it's nearly the same weight as the much larger S22 Ultra. But what did change this year is the camera bump. It's not only larger, but thicker as well. And when the 14 Pro is just laying on the table, it wobbles quite a bit when you touch the screen, but with a case on, this is much less annoying. Overall, I like this design. The back isn't very fingerprinty. I don't love how heavy this thing is, but after all, it's around the same weight as the 13 Pro, so I think most people can get used to it. And this one that I have is the new purple color. I think it looks really nice, and the color does change slightly depending on the lighting. And it has IP68 water and dust resistance, just like last year, so nothing new here. The 14 Pro has a 120Hz screen at around 2K resolution. That's 460 pixels per inch. It's not as sharp as the S22 Ultra at 500 pixels per inch, but when I'm holding both of them at a regular distance like this, I really don't notice a difference in the resolution. But the 14 Pro's maximum brightness increased. It can now go up to 2000 nits, and I think this is a meaningful upgrade. While testing the 13 Pro and S22 Ultra, there were some bright sunny days where I could barely see the 13 Pro's 1200 nits screen, but I could still see the S22 Ultra's 1750 nits screen decently well. And the 14 Pro screen is able to go even brighter than that. So in super bright environments, this increased brightness will definitely come in handy. But my favorite change this year is the always-on display. This feature has existed on Android phones for a long time, but I think I prefer the iPhone's version more. On the iPhone, it shows a dimmed version of the lock screen, the time, and all the lock screen widgets. The widgets are new in iOS 16, and they're pretty cool. They let me see the weather, the battery of my AirPods, and even my calendar at a glance without having to wake the screen. When you receive a notification, it can also show up on the always-on display with all the details. Of course, you can hide the exact details for privacy, but maybe for an app that doesn't really matter, like Uber, I think it's nice to see the entire message just on the always-on display. I usually have the iPhone sitting on a MagSafe stand on my desk, and the dim wallpaper makes it a pretty aesthetic clock. It looks really nice, and I don't really find it too bright. It's pretty easy to tell that the phone is off, so I don't really find it distracting. In general, the always-on display will show a dimmed version of whatever is on the lock screen. So when you have a music or podcast playing, the cover art will show on the always-on display as well. I assumed that having so much going on the AOD would drain a lot of battery. So I did multiple 12-hour battery tests to see exactly how much battery this thing drains. I put all the phones to airplane mode and also closed all the background apps. So most of the battery drain is from the AOD. Without always on display, the iPhone pretty much doesn't use battery. It drained 0% in 12 hours. And with its AOD, which has a pretty colorful wallpaper and a pretty big time font, the iPhone drained 9% over 12 hours. But interestingly, the S22 Ultra with a much simpler always-on display, just a clock on a black background, drained more at 13%. And the Z Flip 4 and Pixel 6 Pro drained 14 and 10% respectively. The only Android phone I found that drained less is the Realme GT at 7%, but its always-on display is also a lot dimmer than the rest of the phones. This result was pretty shocking. Before, I never really thought about how much battery Android always-on displays drained, since very few pixels are actually lit up on it. So I did some more tests to find out how much of it is from system background activities. The S22 Ultra without AOD still dropped around 3% in 12 hours. So the simple AOD on the S22 Ultra drains more than the iPhone's, especially considering the much larger battery in the S22 Ultra. The battery consumption of the iPhone AOD is pretty impressive. I guess Apple's system and chip optimization for AOD made a pretty big difference, and of course, dropping the refresh rate to 1 Hz probably helps helps a lot too. Perhaps even more surprising is that the colorful background for the AOD doesn't actually consume that much battery. Setting the lock screen background to be pure black over the course of 12 hours only saves 2%. If you prefer a black background for the always on display, in iOS 16, you can set your wallpapers to change on tap. So you can very quickly switch between a black and a regular colorful wallpaper. Of course, you can just toggle off the iPhone's always on display, but for me, I will be keeping it on. The battery usually lasts me all day with plenty to spare. So the amount of battery that the always on display drains hasn't been a problem for me in daily life. And I think it likely won't be for most people either. And also, the always on display will turn off automatically when low power mode is on or when the iPhone senses that you're not looking at the screen, like when the phone is lying face down or in your pocket. So realistically, the always on display isn't going to be on for that long in a day. There are also some nice touches in terms of animation. For example, the clock can pop out from behind the subject when it goes to the always on. The notch is now gone and it's replaced by this pill-shaped cutout called Dynamic Island. This is where the Face ID sensors and front camera are. But this year, they integrated some software around this shape, and now you can interact with it. Because of its location, you'll definitely be smudging up the selfie camera, but at least the Face ID sensors don't seem to care that much. The island can do things such as show camera and microphone indicators when an app is using them. And also, system alerts and notifications, like an incoming airdrop, will animate in and out of the island. The animations look really nice and enhances the user experience, but ultimately, I don't think them showing on the island is too different from just normal notifications and alerts. The island also works with now playing apps like Spotify, but honestly, this isn't anything new either. To change songs, it went from one swipe down from the control center to pressing and holding the island. What I think is the real purpose of the island is the ability to continuously monitor another app. For example, the timer in the clock app. I can see it counting down in the island while using another app, and when I press and hold on it, I can also pause or stop the timer. I feel like this is the real potential of the island. Imagine being able to see a countdown on when your Uber driver will arrive while doing something else, or keeping track of scores in a sports event. But none of those things are actually here right now, and in general, currently, there are very few apps that actually have a use for the island, so it really hasn't been that functional for me. There are also a few downsides to this new design. Even though it is 30% smaller than the notch, it actually sometimes obstructs the on-screen content more because it sits lower on the screen than the notch. For example, for wider 2x1 videos, you can see the island cuts in way more than the notch. And regarding the cameras, basically all of them are new except for the telephoto lens, which gives us a perfect opportunity to look at the new processing that Apple calls photonic engine. In daylight conditions, this new processing basically does nothing, and the images look pretty much identical to the iPhone 13 Pros. But at night, it really makes a big difference. Just look at how much better this building looks in the 14 Pro's image. I almost can't believe that this is coming from the same lens and sensor. And it doesn't even have to be super dark for the processing to make a difference either. Look at this building here in the sunset photo. There's just so much more detail in the 14 Pro's photo. I think it's better than the S22 Ultras as well, but that might have more to do with that phone's telephoto lens only being 10 megapixels. And for night mode, I think the iPhone has always been doing a good job. The new process doesn't really bring any big improvements here. The new 48 megapixel main camera does bring some pretty big changes. The higher resolution allows you to zoom in 2 times and still get a nice 12 megapixel image. Look at the text on the sign here. It's so much more resolving than the 13 Pro at 2 times zoom. The 2 times zoom has a focal length equivalent of around 50 millimeters, and I do like this perspective. I think this will be used a lot, especially since the 2 times zoom is a default setting now. But even though the new main sensor is quite a bit larger, the lens actually has a smaller aperture. These two factors mostly cancel out, and you only get a slightly shallower depth of field than the iPhone 13 Pro's main lens. In camera terms, it goes from a full frame equivalent of around f6.9 to f6.23. If we look at this ruler here, you can see the ruler going out of focus slightly earlier on the new iPhone 14 Pro. So in real life, I don't really see a lot more background blur from the 14 Pro versus last gen. This is somewhat of a letdown. And the new main camera also cannot focus as close as before. As you can see, it's at around 7 inches versus 4 inches. You could use the ultra wide's macro mode for close-up, but the main camera usually looks a lot better. So so it might be disappointing if you like to take photos of things close up. The new 48 megapixel images certainly aren't though. They're a lot more detailed, but more importantly, they're way less sharpened. Look at the text on the sign here. The 12 megapixel mode clearly has more sharpening going on, so you kind of see this ugly white glow around the text. But in 48 megapixel mode, it looks so much cleaner. Also, the sign in the front is less noisy and overall just a much better image. However, in order to get a 48 megapixel image, it must be shot in Pro RAW. And these files are pretty huge, averaging around 70 megabytes as opposed to 2 megabytes for a normal image. But it really didn't have to be this way. The files are big because they're in RAW, not because they're high resolution. The 48 megapixel images that I just showed you have all been converted to HEIF first, and this can be done using the Shortcuts app in the iPhone. And this image format is the one that iPhone typically uses. The converted 48 megapixel photos only average around 5 megabytes. The Galaxy S22 that shoots 50 megapixel images in non-RAW mode only averages around 3 megabytes per image. So why isn't there a regular 48 megapixel photo mode? If that existed, I personally would use that to take all of my pictures. I think most likely they didn't give us this because of the sensor readout speed or rolling shutter. A camera sensor typically reads from top to bottom, one line at a time. When the resolution is high, it takes time to read all those 6,000 lines of pixels. Just look at how much longer it takes to snap a 48 megapixel image. And when you take pictures of a fast moving subject, you can see how much more slanted a straight line on it becomes when it's in the 48 megapixel mode. And this is because when it gets to reading the bottom part of the sensor, the subject has already moved. So when the iPhone 14 Pro is in the regular 12 megapixel mode, it's most likely that they're just reading 2 lines at a time and then taking some sort of average, so pixel binning it and not oversampling. That's why in normal mode, the photo snaps much more quickly. Looking at these results, I don't think it's possible to read the full 48 megapixels in the sensor 30 times a second, which means no live photo. And I believe this is the reason why there isn't just a normal 48 megapixel photo mode. This is also likely why we don't have 8K video recording. In video modes, the sensor is read out in the 12 megapixel mode, and I feel like in most cases, it looks pretty similar to the 13 Pro in terms of the resolution and dynamic range. And when comparing to the S22 Ultra, I think Samsung must have changed up the processing, because in the past, it looked really over-sharpened, but now it looks so much more normal, and I actually prefer the S22 Ultra's video over the new iPhone 14 Pros for many of these shots. The iPhone can do ProRes, but it doesn't really help in most cases. I think the ProRes is a tiny bit more detailed, but with more noise. And the file size is absolutely massive. You also need at least 256 gigabytes to even shoot it in 4K. The ultra-wide this year is a bit better, with also a larger sensor, but slower lens. The quality did get better overall. The new ultra-wide captures more light. I think it looks just a little better in most cases. This year, there's also a new selfie camera with autofocus, but it still has a pretty deep depth of field. All the stuff in the background is still mostly in focus. I think it is slightly more detailed when you get really close to it, but it's definitely not the best selfie camera. Especially in this more challenging scenario, I think the S22 Ultra's image looks so much better. And the difference is even more obvious for the selfie video. The iPhone is just much more noisy. But one feature I did find pretty cool is the cinematic mode. Now that it shoots in 4K, it definitely looks a lot more impressive. When it comes to battery life, I was expecting some things. This year, the battery is 5% larger and the chip is made with a more efficient process, so it has every reason to last a bit longer. But for whatever reason, that's just not the case. After 3 hours of social media, which included looping a video and scrolling through Instagram and TikTok, the 14 Pro only dropped 1% less than the 13 Pro. So barely any difference here. And for heavier workloads such as gaming, the iPhone 14 Pro will actually die faster, dropping 3% more than the 13 Pro over 1 hour running the same exact benchmark loop. Having basically zero observable improvement in battery life this generation is a bit tragic. But honestly, this is still one of the most efficient phones that I've tested, and one of the longest lasting phones of this size, even outlasting the S22 Ultra with a much larger battery for casual tasks. For my regular use, it lasts all day pretty confidently, but so did the 13 Pro. I was just hoping for a slightly longer battery life for those days where I'm traveling, so using cellular all day and also using lots of GPS and taking lots of photos. The new SoC in this thing is also barely any faster. In Geekbench, it's only about 3% faster, and 6% faster in Wildlife Extreme. The only notable thing is that it doesn't seem to slow down as quickly or as much after 10 minutes of continuous load. The front and the back also recorded around 2 degrees Celsius lower peak temperature than the 13 Pro. So overall, I think the SoC improvement this year is pretty small, despite the new 4nm process from TSMC. However, this isn't really an issue because even the 13 Pro is already faster than the competition by quite a bit. The new SoC in the 14 Pro is still 30 to 50% faster than the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1, depending on the task. The 8 Plus Gen 1 is a bit better, but still around 20% slower overall. The speed, of course, isn't really an issue for daily tasks, and it is still one of the better phones for gaming. Now for the other aspects of this phone. So the speakers didn't really change much. They still sound great, but it did gain the ability to communicate with satellites in an emergency and also detect serious car crashes. Overall, I feel like this year the 14 Pro didn't really get much better at the things that iPhones are typically good at, such as battery efficiency, speed, and video quality. The 48 megapixel photos are really nice though, but you have a pretty slow shutter and you also have to give up live photos when using it. If you want to store lots of it, you probably have to convert it to another format first, or else it'll take up your storage very quickly. I love the always on display, and the dynamic island is very well animated, but it definitely needs better third-party support. Now I want to show you some phone cases thanks to Rhino Shield, today's video sponsor. Starting with the Mod NX. This one comes with a rim, a frame, and a backplate. You can either use this with the frame and the backplate, or with the frame and the rim. There's also CrashGuard NX, which just comes with a frame and a rim, and this frame is compatible with Mod NX backplates. There's also the Solid Suit. It has a changeable camera ring, so you can switch it up. The buttons on all their iPhone cases are also interchangeable, so you can mix and match different colored buttons. These cases provide a reliable grip and a snug fit. It's also easy to remove and clean. All 3 of these cases provide great protection. For the cases, you can choose between standard or MagSafe. There's also many different colors and designs to choose from, including many collaboration designs. And you can also apply a screen protector and camera lens protector for all-around protection. No matter if you're getting a new phone or not, you can upgrade your case and get a new look for your phone with new accessories. Rhino Shield also has cases for Apple Watch and AirPods. You can use my link in the description and code Ella to get 20% off in the first week and 10% off afterwards. Alright, that's it. Subscribe and I'll see you next time.